Tonight, a special edition of Brian Ross Investigates. Meet the veteran Mississippi reporter still on the case, exposing how gangs rule the state's prisons, even after promised reforms.
Back at it again, Brian. They're not happy with it. A lot of silence. Most of this time, they've kind of just circled the wagons.
In South Carolina, taking on local sheriffs and prosecutors, public money for baseball game tickets, trips to the Galapagos Islands, flying first class all the way, investigative reporting that helps send a powerful prosecutor to prison.
No reaction to the taxpayers. Absolutely nothing.
Plus the internet whiz, teaching the country's leading investigative journalist a thing or two.
I've done about trainings for about 2,000 journalists in the last 4 months. New York Times, Washington Post, ABC, CBS, Associated Press, basically teaching them the tricks of the trade.
And remembering the man who made sure reporters had the resources to cover the plight of America's poor in Appalachia, where Tom Galloway grew up and never forgot.
Tom really dedicated his entire career to trying to help those people who are underserved. Telling their story became part of that work.
From the Law&Crime Network studios in New York City's Herald Square, this is a special edition of Brian Ross Investigates. Good evening and welcome to a special Encore edition of Brian Ross Investigates, highlighting our series of shout-outs, recognizing some of the outstanding local investigative reporting that often doesn't get the attention it deserves. And we start with the work of a veteran reporter who has devoted his life to exposing outrageous violations of human rights in his home state of Mississippi.
It all started with a cell phone call from an inmate back in 2013. Hey, I'm going to tell you about all the corruption that's going on inside the prison and all these beatings and various things that are happening and nothing's being done about them.
It was a call to action for investigative journalist Jerry Mitchell 6 years ago, leading to a damning expose in the Clarion Ledger in Jackson, Mississippi, and a series of supposed reforms in the state prison system.
And all of a sudden I keep getting reports of things getting worse.
So once again, Mitchell is on the case, now turning up evidence of how the understaffed prisons are really being run by criminal gangs.
In lockdown, we join the Mississippi Center for Investigative Reporting and ProPublica to investigate critical understaffing.
This video, obtained by the Marshall Project, shows what officials call a gang-ordered murder on an inmate, seen running from his attackers trying to get away, trapped in a shower cell, stabbed 10 times, and left for dead. One of 4 gang killings inside this prison alone.
It's a horrible situation, and basically even top prison officials have admitted that the gangs are in charge of these prisons. So we've uncovered all these things of how gangs control how prisons operate.
How did it come to be that the gangs, not the warden and the guards, run the prison?
Well, if you don't have enough officers, like if at night, if all you have is a tower officer and really no what they call floor walkers. We exposed in South Mississippi Correctional Institution time after time this happened.
So as a journalist, this is a real challenge because you can't be inside there.
Exactly.
You have to rely on them talking to you. And can you trust their accounts? How do you verify and double check what they tell you?
That's a great, well, you piece it together. You use inmates, you use reports, you use incident reports and things like that. You use correctional officers who work there. Really to kind of get a picture. I love reporting on hidden worlds, and this is like one of them.
It's become a big issue in Mississippi.
This cell phone video surfaced last week.
And once again, Mitchell's investigative reporting is making waves in Mississippi.
And part of the prison on fire.
Investigate TV have uncovered alarming staff shortages at prisons across the country.
There is simply not enough manpower in place to keep tabs on the more than 3,000 inmates that are housed there.
Back at it again, Brian. They're not happy with it. A lot of silence. Most of this time, they've kind of just circled the wagons.
But prison officials have acknowledged the problem.
When you don't have the appropriate level of staff, safety is a concern.
Before his new series on prison exposés, Mitchell made big news when he obtained this photograph of 3 Mississippi college students posing with guns in front of the bullet-ridden sign commemorating the death of Emmett Till, a 14-year-old African-American who was lynched in 1955 after being accused of the rape of a white woman.
I had a friend of mine say this looks like a trophy shot. So instead of a 10-point buck, they're standing in front of the Emmett Till sign. It's just very disturbing.
The 3 students, all members of an Ole Miss fraternity, were suspended. Another black eye for Mitchell's home state.
As a reporter, your obligation is not to protect somebody's reputation. Ours is to tell the truth.
So you're really filling a huge gap in local investigative journalism.
We really feel we are, Brian. It's an important thing. I know you feel, and I feel. Investigative reporting is so key. It's so important to our democracy to make it work right. We have to know. Citizens have to have knowledge of what's really going on.
It is that very same dedication that has led reporter Tony Bartlemy in South Carolina to hold accountable the very people who are supposed to be the guardians of justice, local sheriffs and prosecutors.
No reaction to the taxpayers. Absolutely nothing.
It was a tip to a local investigative reporter that led this summer to prison time for powerful South Carolina prosecutor Dan Johnson. Reporter Tony Bartlemy of the Post and Courier in Charleston, South Carolina, found the evidence he needed for his story on the prosecutor in Johnson's own expense reports.
Nobody had looked at them yet. Nobody had sifted through them. So I got a hold of them, started looking through them, and a bunch of things just immediately popped out.
Including a $173 Uber ride in Minneapolis, where Bartlemy used to live.
And I thought, I bet you he went to Prince's house on the public's dime. And lo and behold, that's exactly what he did. And during that trip, he also spent money on a Major League Baseball game, the Twins. And from there, we started looking into other things like trips to the Galapagos Islands, first-class plane trips to all over the country, and things like that.
Bartlemy, who is the senior reporter on the Post and Courier's investigative team, says they decided to expand their probe into all official expense reports.
So we thought, what are other islands of government in South Carolina that kind of exist on their own without much scrutiny? And sheriffs immediately came to mind. And so we sought every spending record we could get from every county in the state, all 46 counties.
Suspended Greenville County Sheriff Will Lewis is facing more charges tonight.
Among those highlighted by Bartlemy was Sheriff Will Lewis of Greenville County, now facing criminal charges that he was using public money to carry on a sexual relationship with an employee who has now claimed she was raped. He has denied the charges and her claims.
Her allegations that basically forced her to have sex, forced her to do other things, and used that fear of termination, losing her job, as a cudgel.
Next was the sheriff of Florence County.
People who live in the area are speaking out after the man they elected, Sheriff Kenny Boone, was arrested and charged with embezzlement and misconduct in office.
Sheriff Kenny Boone is also now facing state charges as a result of Bartlemy's reporting. He too has pleaded not guilty.
Again, it was all these sort of questionable expenses for personal gain.
The most serious charges came following Bartlemy's story on Sheriff Alex Underwood.
Underwood had a pattern of misbehavior ranging from assaults. He'd assaulted a couple of fire chiefs at a traffic stop. And also a man was live streaming a traffic wreck.
As the man was streaming his video on Facebook, Sheriff Underwood is seen approaching him and can be heard challenging him.
I'm doing a manhunt out here. I got somebody that's armed and dangerous out here. Get on the phone.
There was a scuffle. Essentially, Underwood and his deputies threw the guy in jail, cooked up a bunch of bogus charges, and then tried to cover up when the FBI began to investigate.
Sheriff Underwood is now under federal indictment. He has pleaded not guilty to the charges.
When we put it all together, we produced a very large package of stories that really kind of captured the scope and significance of and history of why sheriffs have gotten into trouble.
Bartleby says his editors know such investigative reporting takes time and money, but that they have decided it is the only way local newspapers can survive.
In the past few years, we've analyzed the data and we've found that people are more likely to subscribe to stories that are done with depth and quality. We found that the sheriff story, for instance, generated the most subscriptions of any story last year or this year. On a local level, it's really the only way we'll be able to survive. And we are finding that investigative journalism, though it's expensive, is what keeps people reading.
On a personal note, I was surprised to learn that Tony Bartleby was the son of the late Joe Bartleby, an NBC News executive who was one of my early bosses and mentors. Nice to see the tradition of hard-hitting journalism continuing in that family. Up next, a shout out for someone who has proven to be so good at what he does that now major news organizations and networks want him to teach their reporters how to do what he does. Back now with our special Encore edition for local journalists whose work deserves our recognition and appreciation, including someone whose skill at digging and investigating is so incredible, major news organizations and networks are hiring him to teach their reporters how to do it. It was in the middle of a blizzard in Washington, D.C. when Seamus Hughes scored one of his many big scoops this year.
It was a snowy day. My kids were playing in the front yard. They were building a snowman, and I needed a break from cleaning off the car.
And for fun, Hughes is the kind of person who likes to look at a website called Pacer that records the activities of federal criminal courts around the country.
Documents have been posted on Pacer in Maryland that day and came across it.
What he came across was the indictment of a member of the U.S. Coast Guard who had purchased a huge quantity of weapons and, authorities say, was about to use them to carry out a mass murder.
We just tweeted it out. And then by the time the snowman was done, we had about 10,000 retweets on it.
It was a huge story that made headlines across the country.
Investigators say he was planning a major attack on innocent civilians.
They say they found at least 15 guns and 1,000 rounds of ammunition.
Prosecutors are calling him a domestic terrorist.
A story that might have gone unnoticed by other journalists, but for Seamus Hughes. And he used the same sleuthing technique to break the story of the government's indictment of WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange.
I was looking at a case in Virginia of a guy who was supporting terrorism, and the prosecutor in that case accidentally filed information related to Julian Assange.
So entirely serendipitous.
Entirely serendipitous.
References to WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange in an unsealed court filing suggesting he might be criminally charged.
WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange has been charged under seal.
Another major story for which the country's leading journalist owed Hughes a giant thank you.
I think there's two things going on, right? One is a lack of training when it comes to open source collection and looking at court records, and the other thing is chasing the news of the day. The latest presidential tweet will get you more clicks than a deep dive in a Coast Guard individual who was thinking about joining neo-Nazism.
And so you go in areas where nobody else is really farming.
Yeah, I think that's fair. There's no farming, and to be fair, we're also losing a lot of journalists in the last couple of years as the industry constrains. And so you're not having the same eyes you used to have on there. These local newspapers don't have federal court reporters sitting at the courthouse pulling stuff.
Obsessive document digger.
And it has brought Hughes a lot of attention with profiles on CBS News and elsewhere. Hughes isn't really even a journalist. He works at George Washington University's Terror Tracking Section, a former U.S. government official who worked in the National Counterterrorism Center. So now he's busy teaching actual journalists how to do their jobs better.
I've done about trainings for about 2,000 journalists in the last 4 months. New York Times, Washington Post, ABC, CBS, Associated Press. Basically teaching them the tricks of the trade.
It all began as Hughes worked to track young Americans who had been recruited by ISIS and Al-Qaeda. He says the threat from those groups is far from over. Of as much concern to Hughes is the spike in what can be called domestic terrorism linked to groups overseas.
Yeah, I'm not sure the media's really picked up the transnational nature of domestic terrorism. And so it's not necessarily domestic terrorism, it's also international. And you see these white supremacist groups have links to organizations in Europe and in Australia and New Zealand. And I think it's going to be a learning curve in the short term. There's also, you have to think of, we've had nearly 20 years of understanding groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS ideology. And understanding the white supremacist and even sovereign citizen ideology is a different animal. And so there's going to be a learning curve.
Why do you do it?
If you give me a piece of information and tell me, I've got 2 days to figure it out, I'm going to roll up my sleeves, make some phone calls, get on a plane, and start talking to people, because that's the only way you're going to be able to figure it out.
Well, thank you so much. Keep up the good work. I think it's safe to say we live in times when the work of Seamus Hughes is more important than ever. Next, a shout out for a team of reporters focusing on the plight of the people living in America's poverty belt, and the man who has quietly made sure they have the money to do it. We close out our special Encore edition of Shoutouts tonight by honoring someone who never got a byline, never appeared in a TV report, but did much to make sure that investigative reporting remained vibrant, especially in America's Appalachian region, where Tom Galloway grew up. He went on to make his fortune, but never forgot where he came from. It was a project that no one news organization had been able to take on. A sweeping indictment of how and why so many people in America's Appalachian region had no safe, reliable source of clean drinking water.
How long would you say you've been coming here, sir?
Reporters from 3 different outlets came together for the project. From the Charleston Gazette-Mail,
My name is Katie Coyne. I'm a reporter at the Charleston Gazette-Mail.
West Virginia Public Broadcasting,
I'm Molly Bourne. I work with West Virginia Public Broadcasting.
and the Lexington Herald-Leader.
My name is Will Wright. I work for the Lexington Herald-Leader. This project especially dives into things that affect people's daily life. Access to water is something that many people don't even think about.
Spending months traveling across West Virginia and Kentucky.
Water should be clear and odorless. And that's something we don't have here and haven't for a very long time. If you turn on your tap and it's white and it smells like chlorine, that's not good.
It was a journalistic tour de force, all made possible by one wealthy lawyer whose only credit was a short screen credit at the end of the video acknowledging the Galloway Foundation, chaired by Tom Galloway, who died earlier this year.
I think he really understood poverty. I think he understood some of the really intense struggles that happen in places like where he grew up in Appalachia, and he had a very deep sense of wanting to give back.
Charlie Sennett runs the Ground Truth Project that spearheaded the water investigation.
Tom understood the power of journalism from his very earliest days as a lawyer, where he took on big coal and really went after some of the companies that were really destroying the environment and treating people very unfairly in the communities where they were based.
As a successful lawyer, Galloway was later involved in going after the misdeeds at the corrupt energy company Enron.
He funded projects about human rights and LGBT rights in Africa.
Brian Ross from ABC News 2020.
He followed up on the reporting that Rhonda Schwartz and I did at ABC News about the treatment of garment factory workers in sweatshops in the American territory of the Northern Marianas.
Blocked fire exits, overheated electrical panels, toilets that don't work, what authorities called flagrant violations of U.S. labor and safety laws.
Part of a legal team that later got a $20 million settlement for some 30,000 workers. But Galloway's passion was for Appalachia, where he grew up in poverty, and then first emerged as a lawyer speaking up for the little guy.
Tom really dedicated his entire career to trying to help those people who are underserved. Telling their story became part of that work. Journalism became a critical appendage to all of the legal work that he did in a way that could tell a story that he wouldn't necessarily be able to tell in the courtroom.
Galloway's backing has already helped to fund major investigations at West Virginia's leading newspaper, the Gazette-Mail, at a time the paper was in financial straits, according to reporter Ken Ward.
Tom Galloway's legacy for Appalachia is not just all of the litigation he did to bring bad guys to justice, but it's the journalism that's going to live on for years and years and years, giving people the kind of information they need about their community. We have 2 reporters in our newsroom now that are funded by them, and at a time when advertising revenues are dropping and it's difficult to keep staff up, those kind of resources, 2 additional reporters, one of them dedicated to covering Southern West Virginia, and the other one dedicated to covering poverty issues in Southern West Virginia.
Galloway was once named Trial Lawyer of the Year by a group called Public Justice, and he lived in a life of luxury with grand homes in Colorado, Washington, D.C., and Martha's Vineyard. But his wife Kathy says he would have traded it all to be one of those investigative reporters he admired so much.
I think he was so enamored of the work that you were able to do, Brian and Rhonda. He would have given his left pinky to be able to have half the talent that you had in journalism.
Do you still drink your tap water, or is this solely what you drink? Not really? Why not?
The water project from Ground Truth came as Galloway knew his days might be numbered. And he died knowing there were Galloway Fellows across Appalachia and elsewhere doing the work he so admired.
He dreams of having a strong investigative journalism unit in every newspaper and radio station across America. He was a brilliant storyteller, and he would like to see those brilliant storytellers telling the public what's happening in their communities across the country. That would be a wish come true for him.
Tom Galloway was a loyal supporter and good friend to me and executive producer Rhonda Schwartz. He'll be missed, but he leaves a legacy of investigative reporters across the country and around the world, trying every day to carry out the work that Tom Galloway so admired. That's our report for tonight. Thanks so much for joining us. We'll see you back here next week on the Law and Crime Network.